Back in 1991, Ted Turner bought the entire Hanna-Barbera library. Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, Yogi Bear, Snagglepuss, the works. The only problem was he didn't have a place for it all. And so, on October 1st, 1992, Turner Broadcast launched a little channel you might have heard of. Cartoon Network. Initially intended for just children's entertainment, it played all kinds of classic cartoons as well as some new kids programming, and then Mike Lazo had an idea. The late night was left relatively untouched, and they still had all these Hanna-Barbera characters that were niche and unused. And so he decided to repurpose them. Space Ghost, Brak, Sealab 2020, Harvey Birdman, you name it. And so, on September 2nd, 2001, Adult Swim launched with Space Ghost Coast to Coast. There were other shows that had some test screens like Sealab 2021, The Brak Show, among others, but one of the most important repurposed shows was Harvey Birdman, turned into Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law. Harvey Birdman, Attorney at Law, followed the sun-powered Bird Boy, defending all kinds of classic Hanna-Barbera characters like Speed Buggy, the Jetsons, and Magilla Gorilla. But his first case was probably the most important: the custody battle between Race Bannon and Dr. Quest. This would set the groundwork and precedent for mocking Jonny Quest. Jonny Quest first aired in 1964, following the adventures of Jonny Quest, his dad Dr. Quest, their dog Bandit, their bodyguard Race Bannon, and Johnny's best friend and sidekick, Haji, which was, from a different time. Together, they travel the world going on wild adventures, encountering all kinds of villains, men in lizard costumes, and all things fantastical. And in 2003, a new globetrotting family took center stage, focused on twin brothers eager to see the world with their depressed failure of a Dr. Dad and their murder-hungry bodyguard, not to mention their charming, loyal, next-level sidekick. Created by Doc Hammer and Jackson Public, the Venture Brothers would go from a Jonny Quest parody to being a full-on media phenomenon. It's important to understand the origins, to understand the context of the landscape in which Venture Brothers was made, because there weren't any series like it, live action or animated, at the time. It laid the groundwork, it was experimental, and I will say with unbridled confidence, it's one of the best pieces of media ever constructed. This is not a review. I'm not going to rate each episode, because personally I can't. This is more akin to a celebration. A deep dive into what makes this series that could have just fallen on its face at the starting line something that has cemented itself as an icon of adult animation and just animation in general. Venture Bros has cultivated one of the most passionate and beloved fan bases out there. It's gripping, emotional, hysterical, and made with such love and genuine care that it just exudes from each carefully crafted pore. That being said, this is your content warning. There will be discussion of all kinds of topics that may be upsetting for some. While this is an animated series, it does not shy away from heavier topics including grief, PTSD, and so much more. So please, watch at your own risk. And so I, the anime academic, the academic chronically allergic to making anime content, will be going episode by episode looking at what made this series so special. Sit back, relax, put some Bowie on, and enjoy. I said this with American Dad, but I feel the need to say it here as well. Obviously, I am not an unbiased party. I adore Venture Brothers, and I have ever since I was a kid. I was 10 when the series first came out, and the moment I saw Dia de los Dangerous for the very first time, I was hooked. I fondly remember watching my Robot Chicken and Venture Brothers Season 1 DVDs on a loop constantly. I participated in the Shirt of the Week Club every time I could and still have shirts I wear to this day. I own and have slept on special limited edition Venture Bros bed sheets. In my quest to better understand the impact media has had on the collective unconscious and the zeitgeist, I have consumed literal years upon years worth of media. Live action, animated, anime, movies, games, whatever. And to this day, Venture Brothers may be one of, if not the most influential pieces of media I've ever witnessed. I know I'm gushing, but it needs to be said. Venture Brothers is a formative show. You will grow as a person from having watched it. It's a series unafraid of being raw or going places few other shows will. It's a story of growth, of loss, of redemption, and of course, it's about family, both found and bound by blood. And so we open the curtain on one of the most transformative pieces of media of the modern age. How did a series with such a storied legacy start? Season 1 is unique. As the show goes on, there will be less and less of what you could consider filler, but in Season 1, these stories are all incredibly important to shaping the family and their relationships. Season 1 could very well be seen as a self-contained story in its own right, mainly because Doc Hammer and Jackson Public didn't even know if they'd get a Season 2. So, what worked? What failed? What orphan-powered experiments will be done? It's time to review Season 1! Hey, it's a pilot. I will say it's a little rough to watch, like Flash animation of the early 2000s bad. You could make the argument it was almost Newgrounds worthy. That's how rough it is in places. Anyway, the pilot does introduce some elements that would be recurring throughout the series, like the cold open and after credit scenes. Not to say other shows didn't have cold opens, even Family Guy would do it several times in the earlier seasons, and several other Adult Swim shows would as well, but it became a Venture Brothers mainstay, as did the after credit scenes. Anyway, this episode opens with a ninja being alerted that Doc Venture is unveiling a new invention in New York. The series opens after the intro with Hank and Dean riding their hoverbikes looking for their precocious dog, Scamp. Hank is played by series creator and writer Christopher McCulloch, while Dean is played by Michael Sinterklaas, who you'd probably recognize as Horo Horo in Shaman King, Guy in Gao Gaigar, or Nadoitra Gilga in Bleach. Dr. Thaddeus Rusty Venture is played by James Urbaniak, who you may recognize as Dr. Zero in Fallout New Vegas and the Big Empty expansion, and of course Brock is played by a little-known actor by the name of Patrick Warburton. That's right, the Tick, Seinfeld, Joe from Family Guy, the gym teacher from Kim Possible, Krunk of Emperor's New Groove. I mean, I could keep naming roles, but you know the man with one of the most iconic voices in the biz, and he delivers brilliantly as Brock, the family bodyguard. Anyway, Dean reminds Hank that they don't have a mom as they hunt down their beloved dog while Rusty plans for his greatest invention ever. It also shows that Rusty just disdains his sons, and he's always chasing his dad's long shadow. Anyway, Rusty takes Scamp's skin off to hopefully turn him into the ideal testing animal. We also get the first introduction to the mighty Monarch and his loyal foot soldiers, as well as his loyal number 2, Dr. Girlfriend. I gotta say the pilot design for the Monarch is great, but it totally makes sense how they'd redesign him going forward. Anyway, the family ends up going to the UN Science Expo, and yeah, they explore the sights of NYC, and we actually get our first display of Brisby B as Hank and Dean are being chased by the Monarch, which will be super important later on, as well as the first shot of Professor Impossible and his wild stretching powers. Doc Venture fails his demonstration, and we get our first shot of Billy Quizboy and Pete White, not to mention one of the best characters ever, General Manhausers. Overall, the pilot is rough, absolutely, but as far as Adult Swim animation at the time, it's honestly pretty on brand. It's what you'd expect from a show sharing airtime with things like C-Lab 2021 or Space Ghost Coast to Coast. It's also inherently longer form. While some Adult Swim shows would be the 23 minutes like home movies, the bulk of them were 11 to 12 minute episodes so they could be smashed together to try and keep the attention of teens indulging in the devil's lettuce. Turtle Bay does have some flaws. Otaku's voice is definitely a choice. The animation is clunky, there's a lot of very basic bare bones effects that seem to be moving it from one set piece to another, but really the only reason the animation is so noticeable here is because of how much it elevates itself later on in the series. If I were to sit you down, have you watch the entire pilot, spin you in the chair, blindfold you, and ask you to describe each of the characters without discussing their physical attributes outside of Hank and Dean, you'd honestly be able to. Rusty is a pill-popping loser scientist, Brock is a murder-hungry, hyper-violent rock god of a bodyguard, and the Monarch is a true and proper villain. The pilot showcases the brilliant vocal talents and precise joke delivery that the show's become so famous for. It's something everyone should experience once, and it's fun to revisit after all these years. But it's definitely not an episode I go back to all that frequently. The next episode, however... The episode has a cold open where Brock is in a poker game with a group of luchadores that try and cheat him, and yeah, he Brocks out. Anyway, Rusty is down south to teach at the University of Mexico and gets some drugs from a Tijuana doctor since he can't get them back home. This episode is also the first introduction of Helper, the family's robotic assistant and one of the greatest characters ever who speaks only in beeps. He's just the best. The episode is noticeably more polished than the pilot, because of course it is. And while it still uses a lot of still shots, they do a much better job of covering it up and using matte backgrounds to keep your attention. In something like, say, The Flintstones, they regularly reuse backgrounds as a means to save money, but with Venture Brothers, they actually really only recycle character models, and even then they're very smart with how they pose them. I don't know, I know it's a technical thing, but it really shows how much love Doc Hammer, Jackson Public, and the whole crew had for the series that they put in that much attention to detail. It's also minor, and I may be reading too much into it, but with there being an Astro Boy reference later in the series and several anime references throughout, I feel like there's a non-zero chance that the Mexican professor is loosely based off Dr. Tenma's design from Astro Boy. Doesn't do anything for the series as a whole, and he's only in it for a few minutes, but it just looks really kinda neat. We also get the reskin of the Monarch and his henchmen, and they admittedly look a lot better. Whether it's because of the sleeker designs being easier to animate or just wanting a change, I really love the look and how simple it is. Plus, Dr. Girlfriend still having her Jackie O style just shines for the character as she is right now. They're also really diving headfirst into the Monarch being way more comedic than you'd initially expect. His first scene in this episode, which for a lot of people is the first episode, really helps him steal the show as it establishes he's willing to take out his own henchmen and how replaceable they are to him. We also get his backstory of being a young boy lost in the woods after his parents were in a plane crash. Taken in by monarch butterflies, he learned their ways and then got a fat inheritance. I'm sure that backstory will never be revisited and has no holes whatsoever. Anyway, he keeps his henchmen numbered except for the one go-getter, Speedy, who's ready to earn his wings. The boys decide to give Helper a tune-up and trick him out, while Doc gets his kidneys stolen and Brock enjoys the local flavor. However, Speedy sees the boys and decides to kidnap them and gets taken out by Brock, who then has to get the boys back. We also see that the Monarch isn't a total monster, and it's just, I'm sorry, there's so much character in this show, in this world they've built up. Like, there's a scene where a Chupacabra jumps out and Brock unalives it and comments on how they're everywhere, and it's just never brought up again. Monarch's flying cocoon of doom is parked on ancient Mexican ruins. And you just passively believe everything about this world, because none of the characters are surprised by it, so why should you be? This is their everyday, and the dialogue carries a no small part of that. The sharp banter, great delivery, and just overall aesthetic brings out each character's true likeness. I will say they use the proto voices of Henchmen 21 and 24 a few times this episode and give different henchmen the same voice, but as it goes on and they get sharper with it, it really becomes night and day. I know it's the first real episode of the season, but there's just so much to love. Even the Brock fight scene on the cocoon is fantastic. I love how selfish Doc is because it just matches his character so well, and we even get a weird dream sequence where he's getting bitten in the womb. Seeing Monarch try and be a real father to the boys when he sees that Doc is so distant is really wholesome and makes you kind of root for the character in his own way. Dr. Girlfriend is a great support for him, and we even find out the Monarch isn't even considered Doc's arch villain, something that amazingly will be expanded upon brilliantly. Dia de los Dangerous is just how you write good TV. Like, any flaws or qualms I have with the show really just come down to the age of the season. If they were to redo the season with modern graphics, it would just be kind of perfect. Even then, though, that old style really does have a genuine charm, and it's a show that's aged exceptionally well for how long it's been around. And speaking of how long things have been around, here we see Gargantua 1, the greatest invention known to man in a retro slideshow with little beeps to change the slide and all. At this point, we really have to celebrate J.G. Thirlwell's soundtrack for the series. If you just listen to the background music, it has such a retro yet contemporary feel to it, and it's all thanks to his incredible talent that there's that extra layer to the show. The music itself almost feels like a character and helps elevate without relying on pop song X to force emotion out of the viewer. Anyway, during the show, we get to see a young Rusty back when he was a kid adventurer playing with his plastic cowboy figures, which is a nice touch when it's juxtaposed to his modern miserableness. Colonel Bud Manstrong and Lieutenant Anna Baldovich call on Rusty because the light is blinking on the problem machine. Remember this. Remember this blinking. If there's one thing you remember about this entire season, let it be the blinking. You'll understand later. Anyway, Anna and Brock have some broadcast foreplay while docking the ship, and Rusty gets to work on the light with Hank and Dean's help. All while Bud gets jealous of Anna and Brock's fondness, and yeah, there's not a ton to talk about with this episode. And that's a good thing. There is no Monarch or any other arch nemesis, it's just Rusty trying to figure out the blinking as he has drug-laced hallucinations of his dad and trying to figure out the problem with the space station that otherwise seems fine, all while Bud goes insane after spooking the boys with this story about the Burt Reynolds classic Sharky's Machine, a movie that came out 20 plus years before the show even premiered. And that's just the charm of Venture Brothers. The fantastical is mixed with the everyday because it's all treated as just mundane. Him going to a space station is just treated as another Tuesday, which may not seem important, but it absolutely is. There's an undercurrent of love and passion to the homages, to not only the Jonny Quest themes and tropes, but also the tropes of the super scientific futures of the 1960s and 70s, where we'd have giant space stations in the far-off world of 2002, and flying cars, and all of those fantastical ideas. Like, comparing this to, say, Rick and Morty doesn't really do it justice. Sure, they're both based off existing properties and deviate enough from them to have their own personalities, but Rick and Morty is more openly mocking it, whereas Venture Brothers is just asking, man, how messed up would Johnny be after having to go through all those adventures? A question they will answer literally in the next season. There's just so much to take in an episode where narratively you think nothing is happening. It's often stated that you need filler episodes in the first season of a show so that the viewer has a better idea of the characters and what they're dealing with, and oh man does Venture Brothers nail it. There's so many small elements that intermingle themselves, but even if you just watch and enjoy the episode on its own, you still get a ton of great jokes, sharp references, and setup for things that you wouldn't even think of. This wouldn't even be the last time we'd see old Bud, and he'd make a comeback in one of the best episodes of the whole series. We get our first proper introduction to Baron von Unterbite and his close counsel, Manic 8-Ball, Catclops, and Girl German Bad Guy. There he believes they've been scheming against him and takes them out while vowing to take out Doc once and for all. Meanwhile, Brock is on a vacation to the mountains, and so the family is on their own for the weekend. It's really sweet seeing how much Hank idolizes Brock, and how Brock at least treats him with baseline kindness and encourages him. We also get our first reveal of Brock being a member of the Office of Secret Intelligence, or the OSI, which won't matter later at all. After Rusty passes out and Helper discovers Rusty is trying to replace him with a new security robot, both the Baron and the Monarch's henchmen try and take Doc out at the same time. He retreats to the panic room, the family gets sucked in as well, and the new security robot starts rampaging around, all while the henchmen all bond. This is really the first time we get 21 and 24 actually characterized, instead of just being the same designs as everyone else. It's a small thing, but it's great to see Proto-Gary. Anyway, while the family is dealing with their own crisis, Brock is camping when he's attacked by a Bigfoot and the $6 Million Man, Steve Summers, which is actually a reference to the $6 Million Man that I doubt most people watching this even realize is a reference to an old 70s show. And wilder than that, the fact that it's Steve and Bigfoot is in of itself a reference to the 5th season of the show, where in one of the episodes he fights with Bigfoot, which may have been a means to try and compete with the Incredible Hulk that was airing at the time. Fun fact, Lee Majors, the aforementioned Money Man, actually played Grandpa Max in the first live-action Ben 10 movie. After confronting them, he finds out they're just trying to escape the military and agrees to help them out. Brock is not a bad person, he's not just a mindless monster, and the fact that he has his own rules is a really great touch. There's actually a really sweet scene where Helper comes to save the day, and it has assorted flashbacks, but one of the flashbacks is to when Helper hugs Brock before his exam, which is actually later in the season. Obviously a cost-saving maneuver, and it doesn't really change anything canonically, just a neat thing to notice. This episode is really a celebration of how diverse the voice acting is, not to mention the incredible writing. Like, half the jokes would not land as well without the right inflection. From the music to the writing to the voice acting, everything was so carefully curated that it's just next level. I mean, this is a show made in 2003 that's referencing one episode of a show from the 70s as the bulk of its B story. We got the mention of the Guild of Calamitous Intent that will also be huge later on. These formative episodes build with just these little tidbits that you don't think much of out of context, but together they paint a much bigger picture. Okay, I don't want to lose the narrative or anything. I don't want to get lost in the sauce, just losing my mind over a perfect show. But when you have an episode like The Incredible Mr. Brisby, how could I not? The family flies down to Africa where Rusty is to meet with Roy Brisby, the creator of Brisby Bee, and forbids the boys from getting off the plane because they angered him. And so the boys try to make their own fun while Brock and Doc go to meet the absolute mad lad, Roy Brisby, and his assistant, Mendeley, as well as his pet panda. They're ambushed, Brock is dragged down and thrown into a tar pit and saved by the chaste Russian agent Molotov, and the boys are kidnapped and taken to Florida by the Orange County Liberation Front. The boys are brainwashed and sent to take out Roy Brisby and their dad. This will be one of the first mentions of David Bowie in the series and is a very important setup for the series going forward. The introduction of Molotov is terrific and celebrates everything she parodies while still being a whole character, and we also get more of Helper, and around this point Hank and Dean really start to differentiate themselves. Sure, they're twins, but Dean is very much the book-learning fact fanatic where Hank looks up to Brock and has this never-say-die attitude. They both kind of approach being a boy adventurer with the same plucky enthusiasm, but their reasons behind it couldn't be more different, and how that's built up as the series goes on is just masterful. Like, again, the dialogue is just so strong that it makes the show as a whole feel more complete. It feels more fleshed out. There's never that just massive exposition dump and you're just steadily fed this information throughout quick little one-offs. Like, the Orange County Liberation Front with the massive oranges on their head is just terrific, especially with how they're portrayed, and episodes like these are super important, because sure, in the last episode we not only had the Monarch, but Baron von Underbite as well. Here we just have Mr. Brisby. He's got his own world domination scheme, and that absolutely makes sense for a Johnny Quest parody. You have recurring and one-off villains, which may seem minor, but the thematics, the soundtrack, the personification of Brisby as this man obsessed with the milk of the honeybee just paint such a vivid picture of the world we're in that it's so brilliant. It may not seem all that groundbreaking, but you can really see the love and attention that went into this series, and it really shouldn't be ignored what a series created with just an absolute love of the source material can be. Brock isn't Ray's, but he's also not a direct opposite of him. Hank and Dean are their own kids, and Doc is far from Dr. Quest. They're the best non-nuclear family out there, and I look back on these episodes with such a fondness because they're the fundamental building blocks to where the series ends up. The series is able to make the wild jumps it does because the base of the series is so secure. They took all this time to showcase characters even when they didn't know if they would get a season 2. They took the time because they knew these characters were worth caring about, and you can view media as cynically as you want, but even when it's all peeled away, you can tell when there's just a love, a passion at the core of a series that shines through even as the credits roll. The boys are doing a seance while Doc dreams of being strangled in the womb, and Brock has a nightmare about how he unalived his football teammate. And as a machine opens, a frightening, mystical specter of a man steps out and puts the boys to sleep. This is Dr. Byron Orpheus, master of that which is unseen, guardian of the mortal world. And the Venture family's new renter with his daughter Triana, who Dean instantly has a crush on, thinking she's a witch when she's just goth. It may be weird to say now, but you have to remember, before 2007, characters like Iron Man, Thor, and Doctor Strange were relatively unknown in the public sphere. Yes, I'm sure you knew about them before that. You're so cool. Please tell me how I'm wrong in the comments and remind me how there was a direct-to-DVD animated Doctor Strange movie and a live-action one from the 70s. Please. It feeds me. But yes, by and large, people didn't really know who Doctor Strange was in the early 2000s, so to have a character like Byron Orpheus, who's basically one half Doctor Strange and one half Vincent Price, is just a celebration of the creator's love of old TV and movies, as well as their deep passion for comics. He's not even close to the only example of it, but for a main cast member, it's so great to see. Even Hank and Dean's pajamas are references to heroes, with Spider-Man and Aquaman, respectively. Anyway, Hank and Dean are out to prove Orpheus is a vampire, and honestly, he's just a divorced single dad trying to do his best, and begins looking around with Rusty when they discover a dream tank that brings your wildest dreams to reality, where Hank, Dean, and Brock are actually trapped. Doc then reveals he used an orphan to power the machine, and that's why it may or may not be evil. I love this episode, and I love that Rusty is the antagonist. He made the machine that's making everyone go insane, and it's 100% because he has no morals. The Triana and Dean stuff is sweet, showing just how sheltered he is, and the stuff with Brock and Hank is just so wholesome in its own way. It's just another layer added on top of everything else that helps build up the complex that much more. The Brock story, not only with Molotov but with his teammate, is just incredible, and even after seeing this episode easily over 24 times, his reconciliation gets me every single time. I cried from laughing so hard, my body hurt. I knew it was coming, and it still got me. Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Magic is just great, and a fantastic intro for Orpheus. Again, the fact you just have these adventures and not just the Monarch constantly arching them is great. It really helps bring the whole show together, seeing them interact in all these different scenarios. Every episode, no matter how small, serves a purpose. If Tag Sail You're It wasn't already my favorite episode, spoilers for later on, Ghost of the Sargasso is a very close second. On a mission years ago, Jonas Venture Sr. is trying to coach Major Tom down as his experimental ship is careening through the sky towards the water. The dialogue is literally just Space Oddity by David Bowie, but with a dramatic flair, and it's brilliant. We get our first appearance of Action Man, Kano, and Colonel Gentleman, members of the original Team Venture, and as they mourn the loss of their friend, we cut to the present, where Rusty is determined to find the test ship and make a mint off of it. He gets in his suit and submerges. However, his sonic emitter awakens the haunted remains of Major Tom as he rises to the surface. This is juxtaposed with the ship being taken over by Ghost Pirates, which are literally just basic Scooby-Doo villains who manage to take advantage of a wounded Brock and take him hostage while taking over the ship. This is our first introduction to the captain, and man, he's just fantastic. The line delivery, again, is just next level. It's just a great Scooby-Doo parody that doesn't outstay its welcome and knows just what to do. The pirates are all catty, and they didn't need to have so much personality, but again, it adds to the show. Rusty not caring about the old Team Venture or having any reverence for it at first seems like he's just cold and unfeeling and resents his dad for no reason, but the more you learn, the more his feelings start to make more and more sense. We'll revisit old Team Venture later in the season, but this is a terrific first introduction to mostly Action Man, who will become somewhat of a staple later on. Ghost of the Sargasso is just another homage done brilliantly, and even though it happens in the middle of nowhere, it continues to help craft this iconic world. The episode opens with Race Bannon stealing a serum from King Cobra, and as he's parachuting down, gets taken out by the falling plane, and Hank gets conked on the head by the falling serum and starts to feel the effects. Meanwhile, Rusty, Pete White, and Billy Quizboy are recruited by Professor Impossible to a think tank in the Arctic. Professor Impossible is voiced by the legendary and downright iconic Stephen Colbert, and is very obviously a riff on the Fantastic Four, with his wife Sally being able to go partially invisible, her brother spontaneously combusting whenever he's around air and screaming in agony, and Ned, their cousin, who's basically a human thumb. Anyway, Professor Impossible was their college professor and wants to use their genius to help his think tank. Meanwhile, Hank, Brock, and Dean are trying to get to the bottom of the serum that landed on Hank, and Doc has to fight his growing interest in Sally, who is infatuated with him. We really get to sit down and experience Doc Cameron, Jackson Public going wild with Pete White and Billy Quizboy, and it's great to see how they bring these characters to life. Between them, 21 and 24, Watch and Ward, the Lepidopterist, and so many countless others, their voice work really brings home so many classic characters, and they each sound super unique, which is great. Sure, there may be some overlap when you listen to them and go, oh, that's Doc or that's Public, but the conversations feel super fresh and there's just a ton to love. Ice Station Impossible doesn't have a ton to really break down. It's funny that they establish Race Bannon as a real character in this world, something that will be built on next season, but it also gives us just, even more world building, letting us know Jonas passed away while Rusty was in college and he and Pete knew each other back then. It's just another absolute banger. If I had to pick a weak episode of the season, it would be Midlife Chrysalis. Now, does that mean it's bad? No, absolutely not. It's like a 9.99999 out of 10 instead of a straight 10 out of 10. The issues are infinitesimal and really are just from the show being 20 years old. Very, very minor audio complaints that otherwise you don't notice unless you've heard the episode over and over. When the family is pulled over by the Air Force, they inform Brock his OSI card has expired and he has to go and get it renewed while calling Rusty Grandpa and throwing him into a midlife crisis. Brock is distraught he lost his license unalive and starts to spiral into depression when he's dragged out to the strip club by Rusty, who is decked out with a medallion and hairpiece and ready for a night out on the town. And that's when he runs into Dr. Girlfriend in disguise, who drugs him, turning him into a caterpillar, all while the Monarch watches from his mighty flying cocoon-shaped fortress in the sky. And so yeah, Rusty turns into a caterpillar monster, referencing Kafka and the Metamorphosis of all things. Tokyo Ghoul fans, eat your heart out. Brock has to train with the boys to get his license back, and Monarch doesn't believe his girlfriend when she assures him nothing happened between the two. The episode is still super solid, and it's really great to get this idea of who Brock is. He isn't a mindless murder maniac. He does it because it's his job, and he's very, very good at his job. He stops himself when he knows he doesn't have the freedom to act how he wants, which is a very important distinction and an amount of self-control. Brock is actually smart in his own way. He's a trained man mountain. Even the agent that gives him the test is the son of General Tracer, who might be one of the best Venture Brothers characters ever, and definitely one of my favorites, though he wouldn't be shown for a couple more seasons. Even just the bits where Hank and Dean are on their own and just act like dumb kids is great. It's wonderful that they're not just always smart or always stupid, they're kids. They're gonna do their own thing, and 9 episodes into the season, you have a very vivid idea of who these characters are, which is great for when we lead directly into... As they're strung up over the Amazon by the menacing Monarch who has stolen Grover Cleveland's time machine, Dean's no-nos start to hurt and he's desperate to be released when Rusty reveals that due to an addendum in the Guild of Calamitous Intent statutes, cruel and unusual torture does have a limit, and so Monarch has to let them all go while Doc figures out what's going on with Dean, and Brock and Hank are taken hostage. The addendum would later be discovered as Rusty's Law, made for when Rusty was younger. Again, these small moments don't seem important, but think about it in the grand scheme of things. Baron von Underbite and the Monarch aren't one-off villains. They have a code they have to follow, and it's a code that is actually written down and not just some moral curve. Meaning, there is organized villainy and arching, and those that are being arched have some say in how they're being arched. This will be explored more in depth, but seeing the start of the mention of the guild is terrific, and will even start to ramp up as we head into Tag Sale. Anyway, Dean is suffering from testicular torsion, and they have to basically make sure his clackers are swinging the right way. All while Brock and Hank hang out in the cocoon and realize that the Monarch really doesn't have anything going on outside of arching Doc. It's nice to see Pete and Billy Quizboy return as Rusty's assistants and almost sidekicks. It's important that he has them, because otherwise it's really just him and the family. Rusty isn't a horrible, unapologetically bad person with no redeemable qualities. He does have friends. Whether he treats them well or not is a different story, but his relationship with Pete is incredibly important to his character as a whole. But they fix Dean, Brock goes on a rampage to liven things up for the Monarch, and eventually they all end up back in the Amazon when Hank starts to complain. Rusty actually shows he cares about Dean, and you could even argue he's giving him preferential treatment over Hank, which is definitely intentional. The episode is a great study of Rusty's relationship with his kids, and we just get a great showcase of high-quality Monarch goodness. The episode opens with a special agent briefing his team on the most dangerous mission of their lives: guarding the Venture compound during a yard sale! In order to make ends meet, Rusty is throwing a yard sale of some of his inventions, and it's attracted all kinds of villains from the Monarch and Baron to newcomers like Phantom Limb and X-Flame of Dr. Girlfriend, and our very first appearance of Augustus St. Cloud talking about Buffy's own Sarah Michelle Gellar. There's also an assortment of cameos of characters like Professor Impossible. But the biggest deal is this is the first time we get the Monarch and Dr. Girlfriend, sure, but also Henchmen 21 and 24 together and on their own as they raid the yard sale for anything cool. Orpheus gets jealous of Doc having so many people ready to arch him when he doesn't have anyone, and decides to rile the crowd up into a frenzy. Hank starts a sub shop, Dean tries to impress Triana, and it's just chaos in the best possible way. There's a scene where Henchman 21 gets a lightsaber and challenges Brock, and it might be one of the funniest scenes in the entire show. Like when I did the American Dad review, I had to review the episodes in the context of the period they came out. Some episodes were super timeless and had a ton of charm, others were very obviously made made to be appreciated in that pocket of time. But Venture Brothers is really, truly evergreen, and I love it. Like, there's not even a ton to talk about with the episode itself because it's just a celebration of how the comedy is written in the show. It devolves exactly how you think it will, and as the Monarch tries to find ways to screw with Dr. Venture, he just starts feeling more and more pathetic until he gets a second wind and properly antagonizes him. I don't know, it's just the strongest episode of the season that started it all. Obviously, next season the story actually kicks into full gear, but this is the best kind of filler episode where it still establishes new elements but isn't afraid to just have fun. Also, the fact that Henchman 24 sounds like Ray Romano is just great. When one of Doc's college friends unalives, he and his college buddies, including Baron von Underbite, go to the funeral where they're kidnapped alongside Brock, and Hank and Dean have to get the old Team Venture together to save their dad. We get the first dialogue from Colonel Gentleman and get introduced to Otto Aquarius, the half-merman member of Team Venture. Kano is actually based off Kano from the Green Hornet, which will be talked about later, and of course we get more Action Man. We also get flashbacks to Rusty's college years with a laugh track added in for comedic effect. It sets up that Rusty knew Brock in college, and that it was actually the Monarch that blew off Baron von Underbite's jaw that he has blamed Rusty for after all these years, though he still doesn't know he didn't do it. We get more insight into Pete and Rusty's relationship and how he dealt with the passing of Jonas Venture Sr. The episode gives us a lot of exposition without feeling like a massive dump, and it also helps make Rusty feel more human by showing him have those moments with Pete and the crew. He has so much more hope and joy in him, and he really seems like he's coming into his own. And then his dad passes, so you're left wondering what really happened as he struggles with his identity. Past Tense is excellent in showcasing not only the original Team Venture, but also Rusty's past and how it intersects with all the other characters' origins. We'll get more on Pete and Brock later, but it's a good jumping off point and actually calls back to the canon of Brock taking out his football teammate, which may not seem important, but it absolutely is. Remember, cartoons back then weren't building season-long narratives. They weren't developing the characters, especially on Adult Swim. There was no overall plot to Aqua Teen. Harvey Birdman wasn't breaking down each case to get to some criminal mastermind. They were quick one-and-dones to keep a stoner's attention. But here they trusted that the audience would be smart enough to not only follow along, but rewatch the series over and over and parse out new clues that in hindsight set up a lot more than you'd previously think. Sounds like a familiar argument, right? Like something you could say about Rick and Morty? Venture Brothers truly laid the groundwork for modern adult animation going forward, and it's just so brilliant to see how it shined even 20 years ago. I don't even know if I should call this a two-parter or not. On the one hand, the next episode is impacted directly by what happens here, but on the other, this is a completely standalone episode on its own. The episode opens with Hank and Dean investigating an ancient tomb when they're attacked by the Monarch and have to stop him by forming Mecha Shiva. And yeah, they're totally making things up on the stand at a courthouse where the Monarch is being held for unaliving a cop. The Guild, led by Phantom Limb, invades the courtroom and puts their plan into motion to try and frame him. We get introduced to Watch, Ward, and the distorted face of the Sovereign, the Lord of the Guild of Calamitous Intent, and it's also shown that the Guild pays off the police so they can continue operating. Basically, the Monarch kicked Dr. Girlfriend out, she goes to Phantom Limb, and he decides to frame the Monarch to get him thrown into prison and out of the picture while capturing one of the Guild's most wanted at the same time. It's great to see Dr. Girlfriend have her own character arc and have her own unique person. We never really experimented with her. She was just always there as a foil with the Monarch, but in this episode, and a little bit in the episodes prior, she definitely does come out of her shell more and is given more time on the screen. Even as the episode ends with the Monarch in prison, there's this undercurrent of tension, complemented brilliantly by J.G. Thirlwell's incredible soundtrack. Like there's something more going on and something that much more dastardly afoot. It is a lot of setup and very little payoff, but in a very intentional way. Episode opens with Rusty clutching his protruding stomach in agony after coming back from Rocky Horror Picture Show. Hank and Dean think he's having a kid and start to freak out about having a new younger sibling. Meanwhile, the Monarch orders 21 and 24 to take out the Venture Brothers after sending the charred remains of Wonder Boy to Captain Sunshine, the first mention of the Kevin Conroy voiced hero. Brock has Orpheus babysit the kids while Doc is in the hospital, and it turns out that Doc's pain was caused by a twin he'd eaten in utero who finally felt it was time to make himself known. Using the Securitron's body, he tries to get revenge on his brother, and the two finally make up, revealing that he is Jonas Venture Jr. Dr. Orpheus follows as Hank and Dean run away on a cross-country hoverbike ride and make sure that no harm befalls them as they have their springtime of youth. They get taken to a Scared Straight program where they run into the Monarch and King Gorilla in prison, and the Monarch convinces them to go home and be the Venture Brothers again. It's actually really nice that Rusty is showing mercy to Jonas, and he does have some humanity left to him. As the family goes to pick up the boys as they hoverbike home, 21 and 24 pull up alongside them to ask about a haircut, pull out one of their blasters, and accidentally pull the trigger, unaliving Hank and Dean. As the credits play and the screen fades to black, everything is gray. And as Dr. Orpheus breaks down at the lives of two young adventurers snuffed out too soon, the season ends. And yeah, Hank and Dean are no more. Talk about a way to end the season, especially not knowing if there was anything to go beyond this. Return to Spider Skull Island is tense, dramatic, full of revelations that wrap up some of the biggest plot points in the season, including Doc's recurring nightmares, and if there never was another episode of the show, a somber conclusion to a truly brilliant outing. Thankfully, there's over 60 more episodes to cover. And there we have it! That's season 1! What's your favorite episode of the season? Least favorite? Anything I got right or wrong? Let me know in the comments below. I know people are going to say something, and it's true. There is a Christmas special that I didn't talk about. TLDR, it's a fun little Christmas jaunt that has some neat references to the season as a whole, but it's largely skippable. It's more just a celebration of a season wrap than anything. It's worth watching once or twice, and it's only 11 minutes long, so it is a quick in and out. Also, one of the few times we get the Krampus animated. Anyway, yeah, Season 1 was an incredible ride with some of the best that Venture Bros has to offer. And even then, you could argue that the season had some weak episodes just in comparison to later seasons, but on the whole was a very high quality first outing. I mean, the amount of quality they packed into 14 short episodes is just mind-boggling, and they only take off from here. We got great character intros, wonderful stories, brilliant writing, dynamic comedy, and one of the best soundtracks in the game, and just, yeah, a beautiful beginning to an iconic show. Please, if you see these reviews, I know I give an abridged coverage of the series, but do pursue it on your own time. This series is such a work of love that no matter how much I might gush about it, nothing I say can do this series justice. And coming next season, we get a ton of Doc and Jonas, our first proper two-parter, a three-parter, and some of the best episodes yet. And so, if you liked what you saw, tell your friends, share the comment, like, comment, and subscribe. I plan on trying to get these reviews out in time for the movie later this year, and I'm so excited to continue sharing my love of one of the best animated series of all time with you all. And so, woo! I'll see you all in Season 2! Goodbye, everybody!